So it's been quite a journey. I just want to say that I am very grateful that you are here with us now, and I am grateful that you're here tonight. I hope that um, our class can be an encouragement to you. I find it interesting that in our class, um, and just really throughout, observing things out in society, within news, within movies, within people of notoriety or fame or whatever, that it really seems like time and time again, I'm told that we're really just a divided country. And so hearing that over and over, I think, has probably shaped some of my thoughts and my viewpoints, and partially why our class is called Fueled by Christ, Powering Positive Change in a Divided and Distracted World. So I think because of that, I think it's important for us to talk about it and important for us to address it. And in fact, in this series, we've spent quite a significant amount of time discussing division. Um, and really, even since then, I want to say it was probably 3 classes that we spent just speaking about division from a historical context, and then more from a more modern time period or more current. But since then, we've also discussed distractions and how to overcome them, and influences, both good and bad. Well, tonight we're going to discuss how we can do our part to unite and heal a divided world. And so, if we think back to some of the things that we talked about, some of those items or thoughts that we had previously explored were all the different ways that we find ourselves divided. And so, we are going to talk tonight about how we overcome those obstacles, the divisions, and we're going to look at some, I think, some interesting stories. For me, they were interesting both scripturally, and then some of the ones that we're going to look at some historical figures. So, as I've done in some of our prior classes, I thought it would be good for us to examine a term like unity. And though the way that we're going to do it this time is we're going to do it from the perspective of just looking at some illustrations, not necessarily going and looking directly at a word or directly at a definition or something like that. We're going to just look at it and observe it from the standpoint of stories. To do that, I want you to think about a time where, for whatever reason, it comes to your mind as a point that was like a rallying cry, some type of event or activity or something that really made it feel like people everywhere were compelled to act. So there's some type of event, there's some type of activity going on. Whatever it was, it really drove people to act, to think, to just rally around something or someone, maybe even some type of thing that's bigger than oneself. So think about that. And while you're doing that, I'm going to share a couple of thoughts that whenever I went through this exercise myself, some of the things that I thought about. So for me, it was World War II. So for me, it seems to be one of those events that is famous for having this type of feeling, but not necessarily initially. At least from my perspective of reading about it and hearing people talk about it, it wasn't really a force for unity until after Pearl Harbor. And so once the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and everybody became aware of the carnage and everything there in Hawaii, it led to people becoming more aware, the United States declaring war, really getting involved in World War II. And it really wasn't until that point, at least from what I can read and have had people share with me, that it was at that point that everybody was galvanized. In Britain, it seems like there was another moment where this occurred, but it was the Battle of Britain. And so that's always one that's stood out in my mind, where you hear, famous speeches around each of them. So FDR's speech around a day of infamy, and then, Winston Churchill talking about never, never, never surrender. And so the Battle of Britain. And both of these are surrounded by famous speeches and are reflected upon historically as a moment where people were just truly unified. They were focused in on specific events that took place, and then some actions or activity that followed it. Some would say that people in Texas may say that after the fall of Goliad and the fall of the Alamo Mission, that those were rallying points, those were rallying cries, and that the Texian army in the different battles that they went through would have, the rallying cry of remember the Alamo, remember Goliad, and things like that. More recently, an event like September 11th probably had some aspects of it that were considered unifying. I would even suggest that with the coronavirus, that there were definitely points of unification, even if only initially. So, just some different thoughts that I had when I was thinking about, what are these points and times where, at least from a historical perspective, people have shared or told us that these were points where people were really galvanized, they were really unified, um, and some of the things that went along with those. The interesting thing to me about these is that every single time these times of unity have been only temporary. So we would have these, what would seem like a catastrophic event, a life-changing event, something very horrific, and the unity that people would enjoy, um, the unity that people would enjoy would only be short-lasted, short-living. And I think that that's likely because of the involvement of humans, the involvement of mankind. Whether you classify people, during those times as ordinary or extraordinary, it really, to me, feels like that because humans are involved, people like you and me, that it's temporary. So let's look at an example of people unifying themselves in Scripture. And to do that, we're going to turn over to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11, we're going to read verses 1 through 8. And I'm going to mute my microphone for just a moment and take a big deep breath. All right, thank you for that. All right, so Genesis 11, starting in verse 1, says, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, 'Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth.' But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, 'If as one people speaking the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other.' So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That's why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth." And so when we look at this story, it's interesting on a variety of fronts, but this effort that these people had was godless. So when you look at what their effort was, it had nothing to do with bringing glory to God. It had nothing to do with honoring Him in some way. It all had to do with themselves. It all had to do with them finding a place and establishing a city, and just really everything being inherently focused on them. Um, it really was, for lack of saying it some other way, it was really just an unbridled attempt at man made glory. So, something to just showcase what they were capable of, something that they were seeking out to do to make themselves look good, feel good, whatever it is. Um, and in doing that, that effort, it's something that, even if not symbolically, like what they were doing just demonstrated their willingness or their desire to replace God with a name for themselves. So, looking at this story, this is a this looks at unification from a whole different perspective. So the people there were unified in achieving a goal and an outcome, but it had absolutely nothing to do with benefiting um, the spread of God's name or the glorification of God. So keep this one in mind, that not all unity is necessarily um, a good thing. And it kind of like it goes back to those elements that we discussed earlier in our class together, where we talked about how sometimes division was a good thing and it was God ordained, versus typically when man or people like us are running the show, it doesn't normally end up very well over time. There are also times when people divide as a way to prevent quarrels. And I'm sure you can think of some times in your life where this has been something that was appropriate or you felt was appropriate. And it was like, it's just better to go separate ways. Or I know sometimes with children, it's oftentimes a very good idea to separate them to prevent quarrels. So if you turn over just maybe just a page or two for you, you turn over to Genesis chapter 13, and it's exactly that type of situation where people are trying to prevent quarrels. So verse 5 says that now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together, and quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in land at the time. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we're brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt toward Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. So, and we talked about what ultimately happens to Sodom and Gomorrah, and the whole world really shares in that story. So I find it interesting that, ironically, in Genesis chapter 14, Abram rescues Lot from the quarreling that happens where he chose to live. So he chose, and they chose together to separate. And it just turns out, like I said, to me, it's ironic that in Genesis chapter 14, there you go, you have Abraham needing to rescue Lot because of quarreling and him being held captive. Then in chapter 19 of Genesis, then you have the whole Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot's residing, his family, and the destruction of the cities, and Lot fleeing that area. So I want to share these stories because I think it helps set the stage for the next story. So these two stories, scriptural, we have examples. They're really interesting, kind of opposites where you have the Tower of Babel, and then you have Lot and Abraham separating. Well, the reason I want to share this is because this next one, it's about a guy named David Lipscomb. And some of you may or may not have heard of David Lipscomb. There's a university named after him in Tennessee, and it's a Christian Church of Christ affiliated school. And and there's some history within what he did in the state of Tennessee, and what he did for Churches of Christ, as far as the gospel advocate, and editing it and distributing it, and the readership that he amassed through those things. And